Hey everyone. If you have joined the webinar already, we're going to give this a few minutes just to give everyone else a chance to join as well. As you've seen in the registration, we will be talking about Corda Support in the latest Ganache release. With me, we've got Nick Rogers from R3 and David, who's been working from the Truffle side. So we'll give this about 2 minutes and then we will jump right in. There we go. That was roughly a 2 minutes opportunity for people to join. So hi, welcome for joining us in this webinar. As I've mentioned before, we are going to talk about Corda Support in the latest version of Ganache. Now, looking at our audience, we have a good split between people who are already familiar with Ganache and people who are familiar with Corda, and I assume very few who are familiar with both. So just to give you a quick overview of what we're talking about today is Corda, which is a DLT or a blockchain solution for enterprise and business. And Corda is seeing a lot of use in the financial sector, logistics companies, mobile phone operators, startups that are building solutions for existing businesses, or any kind of situation where you want to have full proven identities and a permission network where various parties can communicate with each other without needing a central party that controls everything and wants to have all the benefits of a blockchain type of solution, but doesn't want to use a public blockchain like Ethereum or Bitcoin. For the people who are not familiar with Truffle Ganache, they have a wonderful reputation in the Ethereum space as being the tool to be able to get started on developing decentralized applications in the Ethereum space. It makes the entire experience of starting up a local network, deploying to it, and testing in it far easier. Now, before we dive into the content itself, I wanted to add a few show notes. The first is that whenever you have a question, you'll find a button on the bottom right corner with a little plus where you can select Ask a Question. Anytime that you have a question during this webinar, please enter it there. And by the end of the webinar, when we're done with our short presentation, we will answer all of your questions in the order that they came in. Second, at some point, you will see a green button at the bottom of the screen that says Get Truffle Ganache. You can click that to download that and get started. So with that out of the way, the reason why we're so excited about this collaboration, obviously from a Ganache perspective, I'll let David comment on that, but adding more networks and more functionality is always a big win because it gives developers more opportunities to be able to address multiple use cases. From R3's perspective, why I'm so excited about it is that the development experience with Corda is something we're quite proud of. You can write everything in Java or Kotlin, the languages you're used to. It's easy to integrate with your own backends. There are no new languages you have to learn, but there are some rough edges as well. And one of the rough edges that often people were at least irritated by, if not stuck on, is that being able to run a Corda application locally involves running multiple services, which we call Corda nodes, and starting that up and refreshing that every time that you had a new version of the application involves running scripts in a terminal. And later, when Nick is going to demonstrate how a developer would use Ganache in practice, he will show you what that looks and feels like. So the interesting thing about Ganache for us is that it makes that developer experience that much better and that much more pleasant. It allows you to run nodes from a visual UI. You can select versions of it. The shell access where you can type commands to each of these nodes is integrated in the same visual tool. You get a nice visual map of all the transactions that happened, what applications they came from, what your local network looks like, and you're free to configure those all in that visual tool without having to go into config files and try your hand at experimenting how you might implement those things there. So that makes life a whole lot easier for a developer. But of course, seeing that in practice makes this a lot easier to understand. So Nick, can you show us the application developer's perspective on this?
Okay, can everyone hear me? Realizing I'm the only one not muted, so I'm going to assume yes. So in just a second here, I'm going to share my screen, and we're actually going to walk through a simple CorDapp with the front end. So without further ado, so the first thing you're going to see isn't super exciting. I'll give, perfect. Thank you very much, David, for making that full screen. So what you see here is two repositories. And per Chris's comment, Corda is sometimes pigeonholed into financial services use cases and kind of B2B use cases and the like. What I'm hoping to demonstrate here is that it's a really flexible platform, and we're actually going to do something pretty creative on the front end to showcase some on-ledger data. So Chris already gave you the sales pitch. There's a whole bunch of things that I'm really excited about Ganache and how it improves the developer experience. What we're going to do in this presentation is actually walk through the manual process of testing a CorDapp and a front end locally, so you can understand some of the pain points that Ganache fixes. Then we're going to spin up Ganache and breeze through all of those steps, as well as demonstrate a few of the features that Ganache has added, not just improved, to the developer experience. So inside of this repository, currently open in VS Code, we have a simple front-end application that renders a Rubik's Cube, or in this case, a distributed ledger cube. I had a lot of fun building this, but the point really was to demonstrate the flexibility of data you can persist to the ledger. So this is a simple Express Node React app, nothing super complicated. I'm using Webpack for any of those front-end developers out there to compile some JS behind the scenes. But let's actually take a look at what it looks like. So I'm going to use two really simple commands to just start everything up. One to compile the front-end code and one to distribute it locally. Okay. The wonderful thing about JavaScript is it's super fast. Okay, so this is distributed ledger cube, and we'll check out the actual front end in just a second. What we're expecting is the front end to deliver us a message saying, I am not connected to any Corda nodes, because we have not spun up any Corda nodes locally. And again, in the context of Corda, all of the data is going to be inside of the vault, or rather storage, of an individual Corda node. So if I click just play, we'll be taken to this simulation screen. Again, nothing fancy. This is just a simple JavaScript application that's looking to connect to a Corda node. So in this simulation, I can rotate a Rubik's Cube. I can make transformations to it. And all of this is done using 3JS, which is like a 3D rendering modeling tool. There's a move queue that keeps track of moves to be made. And then there's this little connect button that lets us attempt to connect to a local Corda node. And you can see that when we attempt to connect, again, it says failed to connect at the bottom. So let's remedy that situation. Let's actually persist some data to the ledger using the traditional CorDapp developer workflow. That brings us to the second repository in question. I have here open in Intellij. This is my CorDapp. So it's in a package called Distributed Ledger Cube. I just have the README open. And again, both of these repositories are actually available on my GitHub. Rogers A. Nick, they're all open source. But in order to run this application, or rather run these Corda nodes, we actually have to use some built-in scripts that Chris was talking about earlier. So I'm going to run those scripts now. The first is a Gradle task called deploy nodes. And I'll explain what's going on while we run that. So deploy nodes takes all of the Kotlin code I have written in these contract and workflow modules. And these are Corda specific terminology. So if you're not familiar with the Corda ecosystem, all you need to understand is that these two modules comprise all of my CorDapp code. They are the bits of software I want my Corda node to run. And what the deploy nodes task is doing is actually building directories of files and certificates and the software I want these nodes to run behind the scenes. So let's take a look at what that actually looks like on my computer. So what was just generated were all of these directories for each of the nodes. So under the hood, a Corda node is literally a Java runtime environment and some file folder directories. There's certificates, there's the actual Corda jar itself, and then inside of here are the CorDapps I was hoping to distribute. Cool. So we've deployed these nodes, we've constructed them, we've built them behind the scenes. But what we have to do now is a second part of this manual process, again, something that Ganache will take care of for us in the future, is we have to run these nodes locally. So I'm gonna do that using another distributable script, something that we as R3 provide to actually initialize each of these nodes that now exists or is manifested as each of the constructed directories. Okay. So what the run nodes script does, as you can see here, it's all manual. I just literally called run nodes from an integrated terminal in Intellij. What that script does is it causes nodes to start locally on my machine and then allows me an interface to those nodes via the Corda crash shell. The Corda crash shell is just a simple shell interface that connects to the underlying node via RPC. So one thing you'll know if you've worked with Corda before is that when you go to deploy nodes using the deploy nodes task, and this is quite a pain point, frequently, only 2 or 3 of however many nodes you want to start will start. And the reason for that is the deploy nodes script sometimes erroneously submits 2 commands to the same terminal, and they end up getting kind of garbled. And it's something that you have to manually fix as a developer. This is one of those stopping points that Chris discussed in the developer experience for a new developer. So I am going to copy paste in the command to manually start the node that failed to start, and we should see it start in just a second. Okay, so at this point in time, I've run several commands in a local terminal. I've already had to do 1 bug fix, and this is the standard workflow. You know, I like to say that we are absolute experts in the implementation of this specific version of DLT. What we're not experts in is how we present that information, which is, again, why I'm so excited about Ganache as a product. So we have these 3 things running. Now what I'm going to do behind the scenes is start a web server written in Kotlin to act as an intermediary between our front end and the Corda node. And this part of the workflow is actually going to remain the same in the traditional development workflow, as well as the adapted workflow for Ganache. So I'm using a Gradle command here to run a web server on our behalf, nothing too complicated. Excellent. So you'll see it starts up, and you can actually see the logs from the web server inside of this integrated terminal. Now, when I go back to the front end, is that the front end will display a message saying we are now connected to a node. We are able to read data from the ledger of that node, but we haven't populated that vault or that ledger with any data. So we should see a message that says no Corda cubes to display, or rather no active cubes found. But lucky for us, we know at least something's working because we get this green connected modal at the bottom. Okay, so here's where the rubber hits the road. We're going to actually populate the vault with data, and then we're going to make updates to real data, real on-ledger data, and have that reflect the transformed state of a Rubik's Cube. Okay, so in order to do so, we're going to interact with the Corda crash shell. I have a couple of commands prefab here, so I'm just going to copy paste them in. But the first thing I'm going to do, you can see here that the Corda crash shell gives us access to flows inside of the context of Corda. Flows are what we will use to, in general, create, persist, read, update, delete on ledger data. So the very first thing we're going to do is run a flow to issue a cube onto the ledger. This flow takes a single parameter called solvers, which we specify as a legal identity party A. Okay, in that case, we do have a slight typo. But we move on. If there isn't a live debugging sesh, then it doesn't really count as a demo. Okay. So as you can see, the interface for interacting with a Corda node manually is not super pleasant. Finally, there we go. So now we've issued a Rubik's Cube, or a representation of a Rubik's Cube, onto the ledger using a Corda node through this shell. And what's returned to us, or the data that we can understand as a developer, is simply whatever we have explicitly specified to be returned to the flow. That's stringified and logged out to the shell. So in this case, I get this tiny little paragraph that says, success, you've done it. You've logged a cube state to the ledger. It's not particularly useful. And if you'll see, if I run it more than once, it just kind of clutters up my crash shell. And again, it's not a particularly pleasant interface. What I can do is I can run vault queries. And this is kind of the standard or de facto way of interacting with ledger data through the crash shell. Especially as a beginner developer, this is something you'll be doing all the time, or would be if you weren't using Ganache, which is what I'm very much hoping you do so after seeing this presentation. So I'm going to run another command. This is a utility you have access to inside of the crash shell. And this is a vault query. And you can see it returns to us this glorious interface of stringified state data that we have issued onto the ledger. I say glorious, obviously, with a ton of sarcasm. I'm not a huge fan of the text-based interface, and I'll demonstrate later how Ganache improves on this experience. But all things aside, we've now issued 2 cubes onto the ledger. If we go to our front end and we refresh our data, we'll see 2 Rubik's cubes persisted to the ledger. So we'll go ahead and make a transformation to these cubes. And then I'll save that. Now, when I save it, what's going to happen is behind the scenes, the updated moves made to this cube state are going to be persisted. Great. So from a front end perspective, I can tell that the individual cube has been updated. As you can see here, the state has changed. There is some level of persistence. But as a developer, I actually want to understand what happened in that transaction. And with the Corda crash shell, that becomes very difficult. How do I then go and look at what the transaction context was? What happened behind the scene? I could run another vault query, which you'll see will return all of the cube states I have on ledger. But I mean, from the small text on a white background that you can see on the screen, the interface for me to determine whether or not I have successfully updated the state of on-ledger data isn't ideal. So with that, we're going to move on to Ganache and hopefully blow you all away with the dramatic improvement of representations of state data on ledger. So I'm going to close down all of these Corda nodes. Great. I'm also going to kill our web server. It's running in the background, and we're going to move on to the second part of this demonstration. Great, so everything is shut down, and we're back to our initial state where our front end is unable to connect to a Corda node. And part of that is because there's no Corda nodes running. We just shut down our manual developer process. And again, now we're moving on to our Ganache-enabled workflow. So instead of running those two commands, dealing with the bug, and then monitoring crash shells, all I'm going to do is open up the Ganache application. Which you'll see loads up right here. I have a pre-configured workspace, which David will speak about in more detail. For now, all you need to know is it's going to start up the nodes that I need for this demonstration. Excellent. So as you can see, instead of messing around with manual terminal commands, Ganache is doing everything for me. One other thing to note is that when you run the deploy nodes task locally, your nodes use an in-memory database called H2. H2 has its own quirks and frankly isn't suitable for testing any kind of serious application. Behind the scenes, Ganache uses Postgres, which is a much more scalable, I would argue, more production-like implementation or solution. For context, for those of you who come from outside of the Corda ecosystem, Corda is able to persist its vault in a whole bunch of database technologies. They're kind of pluggable per se. And again, H2 is just not as viable as Postgres, which Ganache uses behind the scenes. So as you can see, Ganache has done all the heavy lifting behind the scenes. It returns to me an interface through which I can view 4 nodes that we'll be interacting with through the front end. So like I mentioned before, I still have to run a web server behind the scenes. This is just kind of part of the process to create an intermediary between the Corda nodes and the front end. In this case, we have a task just called run Ganache server. The only difference between that and the other task is we've adjusted the port numbers to match those on Ganache. Okay. So that's started up as well. Now, if I refresh my front end, we should see previously persisted on ledger data. Now, what I love, what I'm a huge fan of, is that Ganache has effectively kept data from previous transactions that I persisted to the ledger in a previous development session. That has never really been the case with developing locally with Corda. Every time you run the deploy node script, it's all wiped out. And we can actually go and look at the 2 transactions that I have issued onto the ledger and analyze their contents. So for the purposes of this demonstration, we'll run through the same steps we did previously. We'll issue a fresh Rubik's Cube onto the ledger. We'll then modify the state of that Rubik's Cube, and then we'll look at the transactions to see how much better of a view it is into the operations I'm performing on ledger data, as opposed to the manual vault querying that I was doing previously. And for reference, inside of Ganache, before we dive in, these 5 tabs represent 5 broad categories of functionality through which I can interact with a Corda node. So the first screen we landed on was the node screen, where again, I can see all of my nodes. The second screen is displaying to me all of the transaction data that is available inside of the nodes we're looking at. The CorDapps tab shows a summary of which CorDapps are available on each node. Again, this is my software. I have written a CorDapp. Ganache and Corda are what we're using to run my CorDapp. And finally, I have this shells interface. And this is great, again, because it provides kind of a consolidated view for me to interact with all of my Corda nodes without having to manage a whole bunch of terminal tabs floating around the screen. Great. So I just self-issued a Rubik's Cube. And you'll see we have that same message that appears here, that same kind of gross stringified message. Now that's part of the Corda crash shell itself. But if we go back to the transactions tab, we'll see a new transaction has appeared that actually contains the contents of what I just did and lets me go through and explore what happened. So you can see I have exactly 1 output state. I've issued something onto the ledger. Nothing was consumed. I've only issued data onto the ledger. And then I can actually browse the contents of that state. So I can see I've listed party A as the issuer. I've listed party A as the only person who's able to solve a given Rubik's Cube. And then I can dive into the state of a Rubik's Cube, which for those of you who are interested, the state of a Rubik's Cube as I've represented it is just an array of colored cube faces. And ultimately, when you combine 6 sides of 9 cube faces, you can represent the entire state of a Rubik's Cube on Ledger in a fairly simple manner. Okay, now if I go back here and refresh the front end, you'll see I now have a second Rubik's Cube on Ledger. This is an unaltered Rubik's Cube. Nothing has happened to it yet. So I'm going to make 2 transformations, and then we'll take a look at what that transaction data looks like in Ganache. Okay, I've saved it. So we're going to go back to Ganache, click on the Transactions tab, and you'll see that a new transaction has appeared. If I click into this, we can go and look at the contents of the transaction. In this case, I have consumed exactly 1 Rubik's Cube and produced exactly 1 new Rubik's Cube, reflecting the moves, transformations, mutations that I was hoping to make to the state. So again, instead of like a stringified representation of state data, I have this really nice interface to go and analyze what happened. So let's make this really specific. In input state 1, I had a cube state with one side that was all orange. In output state 1, based on my transformation, that same side is now comprised of orange, blue, and yellow colors. And that's reflected here. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of looking at data or understanding transaction data with Ganache. As you can see, it's a pretty dramatic improvement over just a simple crash shell. There are some other important things I'm going to demonstrate about Ganache that I really enjoy. The most important thing for me is the logs. So it's really important to be able to access the logs of an operating Corda node. And the way you do so in the manual workflow is you go into the constructed folder and you open the directory that contains the node. If you're more of a terminal user, you don't have to use an IDE for this. You could just cat out the contents of the log files. But I am an IDE user. I traditionally default to this. So I have to navigate to the built node. I have to open it as a text file, and then I can scroll to the bottom of the logs, but it's not organized. It's not presented to me in a way that's useful. And I like the way that Ganache actually encourages users to look at the logs and understand what's happening by prioritizing it as a tab. So I think that's a really useful thing. The other thing that's really useful is that when one of these nodes goes offline, Ganache will display a message that suggests I can restart the node rather than having to redeploy and then run the build node script again, losing all of my persisted data so far. So that's kind of another benefit of the updated Ganache workflow. So if you've stuck with us for that whole time, that's kind of the major features I wanted to show off about Ganache. If you're interested in learning more about the repository itself, I'm going to show the actual title of the repo for just a second on screen. So that's the repo. Feel free to navigate to GitHub and check out the code. Again, I want to thank the Truffle team so much. This is a fantastic tool, and I look forward to continued improvements and using it in my developer workflow as a developer at R3 going forward. So I'll hand it over to David to chat a little bit about workspaces and how things are being managed from a configuration standpoint.
All right, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Chris. So my name is David. I am the Ganache lead at Truffle. And we've been working on this for probably over 6 months now. So it's awesome to finally get to do this webinar with you guys. So I'm going to go over the how Ganache is built. Not so much the features of Ganache, just like how things are started up. Because I think a lot of developers kind of curious as to how this kind of thing can be done. Because we work on Windows, we work on Linux, and we work on Mac, and you need to install nothing. So you don't need Java, you don't need Postgres installed, you don't need the different Corda versions or the Bootstrapper. We take care of all that for you. So also, don't forget, you can ask questions. There's a link at the bottom of the screen for ask a question. And you can also go and get Ganache now while I'm talking if you want. There's a button right below my face that you can click for that. All right, so let me get my screen sharing. So go ahead and switch. And okay, so I have already started Ganache. Let's go ahead and delete this workspace so you can see what it would look like when you first come in. This initial Ganache screen that you'll see lets you pick between Ethereum and Corda. So I have Corda selected right now, and you can see you can toggle between the two. Can you guys, someone said they can't hear me. Is my mic not working in the chat? Okay. Okay, awesome. I'll keep going. Okay. The way it works, so I'm going to do this quick start workspace, which will start up 3 nodes and 1 notary with a pre-configured like a default for those. And I'll explain what's happening in the background when this happens. So some of this will go by really quickly. So I'm going to actually talk about that before I click the button. But the first thing that Ganache does is it goes out to a repository on GitHub and downloads the prerequisites. So we don't ship Ganache with the Java binaries, the Postgres binaries, and all the Corda versions inside of our binary, because that would be huge. So we actually do that just in time. So when I click this, it's going to check to see if I've downloaded them. And it's not going to download them in this case, but usually on your first run, it will go out and download these things, these prereqs. So here we go. So this can take some time on startup because it's doing a lot of work in the background, starting up 4 nodes. And so you can just see all the steps that it's taking as we go. So it's downloaded the JRE. Now it's starting it up, and it's running the Corda Network Bootstrapper. And then it will start the nodes. And as long as I don't have another version running with already bound to those ports, we're good. It should just start up fine. So what's interesting that just happened here is that sometimes when you bootstrap nodes, it will fail for some reason. It's called a capsule not extracted message, which you may have seen when developing with Corda and trying to bootstrap something. When that happens, we just try again. It's usually some sort of race condition as far as I understand. So we automate that restart process, which is nice that you don't have to worry about that anymore. So again, you've seen all of these screens. So what I want to show you now is, let's see, someone is having an issue with the screen class not being clear. So when starting up Corda nodes, it uses a lot of your CPU. And maybe my machine was having a problem. Is it clearer now, Anthony? So. All right, I'll turn off my video and we'll see if that improves things. Okay. I can also shrink this window a little bit, and maybe that will help. So it has less data to send. So I'll just go over some of the configurations options real quick. And yeah, and then we'll move on to questions. So get your questions ready. So I can also, this is an Electron app. I failed to mention that earlier. So I'm wondering if I can just some things in. Sorry. So you can name your workspaces and then persist them. And you can also, this is where you add your CorDapp projects. So I'm selecting a project now. And so now when you save and you restart, it will automatically find your CorDapp jar files and add them to the nodes. And you can actually customize which nodes your CorDapp is added to by going over to the nodes and the notaries tabs, selecting the one you want to edit, and now you can come in and you can pick your projects that you want installed. You can also change the network map by clicking and selecting the nodes you want this node connected to. So if I unselect party C here and hit save and go to party C, party A is automatically unselected there. So they won't be able to see each other, but I want them selected, so I'll do that. In here, you can also specify the RPC port, admin port, PTP port, etc., and change the legal name. And same with the notaries, and you can add additional notaries as well. In general, you'll want to start up as few nodes and notaries as you need. And that's just because these can take up a lot of your system's memory. So on my hardware, we recommend 10, but it might be different on your hardware. I've managed to start 15 nodes. It took a while, so I didn't want to demo that today. So yeah, you save and restart, and it will now apply the CorDapp that is selected to the nodes, or install that onto the nodes. So there won't be anything to see because I haven't run any transactions. So there's not much more to see for this. Nick, I think, covered everything else. So I think with that, back to Chris.
Awesome. Thank you for a fantastic demonstration there, David. So one of the things that I think really stands out when you look at this tool is that it helps you to go from an initial interest in Corda where you just want to check something out, you download the sample app, and you want to kick the tires, change some stuff around in the code, and just get an impression of how things work, right? That's typically how developers go through this kind of experience of checking out new platforms. The awesome thing about Ganache is that next to just making it as easy as doing a git clone, opening it up in IntelliJ, and running Ganache to start everything up and download all the dependencies and set up Java and set up Postgres, so you don't have to worry about that, is that it goes from there all the way to, I have now built a real Corda application and I want to check out how it runs if I have multiple nodes in different configurations with different company or person names running on different versions. Apologies. And getting a sense of okay, that's awkward. Sorry about that. And getting a sense of what a real running Corda app looks like. So thank you both, Nick and David, for the demonstration. If there are any questions at all, now would be the time to write them because we'd be happy to answer them. I think that means everything is clear.
So, Chris, I think we have one question. The question is, could we add projects from a remote server as well? So I think I'm going to hand that to David. I think that would be more of a product roadmap question. I don't think that is the case right now, but it's certainly something we could consider in future iterations.
So it's one of the features we have is that we will watch the project directory for changes. So when you're working in IntelliJ and you rebuild your project, Ganache will prompt you to restart, saying your project files have changed. Would you like to automatically restart? Doing that on a remote server, that could be a little bit tricky. I mean, we could do it with polling. And then, yeah, so out of the box, I don't think that would work. But that could be something that we add to a future roadmap. Thank you.
Exactly. I think the powerful spot for Ganache is being a tool that makes developing a Corda app super easy. The moment you go to deployment, you entering a whole set of complications around security. If there are other partners on the Corda network that you're talking to, you probably don't have access to their resources and their servers. So that is just the whole Pandora's box of extra functionality. That said, Corda app development is a big deal and a very big part of the process. And every time you want to update something on your remote server, you're going to develop it live first. So it will take care of most of the life cycle of what you would ever see as a Corda app developer.
I think it also plays a really important role when you're working on a CorDapp at scale. So beyond what we've talked about in terms of aiding the developer experience for new CorDapp developers, oftentimes you'll be working on a team of developers, some of whom know about Corda, some of whom do not. They might be more focused on the front end, and they might be trying to just make things work with the integration points that are provided. And Ganache really bridges that gap in a way that we haven't previously. So this is a little bit off topic from the remote server question, but I do think that's important to call out. If you're a front-end developer who's trying to work with a team that's persisting things on DLT generally, it's just a no-brainer.
Exactly. Cool. I see there's another question around turning this into an Intellij plugin. I am currently not aware of any such plans. David, you want to comment on that you also don't have such plans? Or
we have not talked about that at all, no.
Exactly. It is a good idea, though. Like, integrating into IDEs is awesome. I think that just because it's a desktop application that you can already run on Windows, Mac, and Linux, you'll get most of the benefits, even if it doesn't live inside of your IDE window. So I hope that answered your question, Adele. And with that, I think we are all out of questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It has been an absolute pleasure showing this off to you. It's been a labor of love between a whole bunch of us, but we're quite proud with the end result of that. So thank you, and take care, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.